Okay, everyone, good morning. So I'm going to start with asking you if you can describe an article from the ones that you read that really grabs your attention. So maybe Alana.
Okay, so an article that I read that grabbed my attention was International Online Reciprocal Peer Tutoring to Promote Modern Language Development in Primary Schools. And that's by Alan Thurston, David Duran, Erica Cunningham, Sylvia Blanche, and Keith Topping. So, what was interesting to me about this article was the use of international peer tutoring to help with both L1 and L2 gains in the students. So there was a process of error correction between the students. And so some were from Scotland, others were from Catalonia. And through that error correction process, students were able to then later identify the errors in their own L2 um, speech and also in their L1. So it helped them in their native languages and in their second language as well.
Okay, and these questions are for all of you, not only for Alana. Why do you think this article is significant to applied linguistics? You guys can answer. I mean, it's not bad.
Well, I think it really shows a creative method when you're thinking about second language acquisition. So it's not the traditional classroom in the sense that there's a teacher and many students, but actually the students are more independent and there's more learner autonomy because it's just a one-on-one intervention. It's a more relaxed environment. There are less power differentials, so the students may feel more comfortable in that environment and maybe their affective filters are lowered. So I think that definitely helps with second language acquisition.
So you mentioned Alana second language acquisition as like a main field in this paper that you mentioned. And how would you relate this to second language acquisition? To what aspects?
So I would say, I think I'm remembering back to the stages actually of language acquisition, L1 acquisition. I think we saw in Brian's class that talked about how in language acquisition we all go through these certain steps, and L2 acquisition mirrors that. And so there comes a point when students are producing speech, but they're not necessarily aware of the errors. And so I think this intervention helps specifically with that stage to say, to reinforce what they already know and say, this was great, or maybe this could be worked on. So to make them aware of certain patterns, grammatically speaking, and to just help them with their overall confidence in the language as well.
Okay. And then I found it interesting right now that you mentioned this concept of power differentials in this article because I read this article too. And this is not really something that I observed, and I think it is interesting that you mention it. So I would like to know if you could explain this a little bit further. Power
Okay.
differential.
So the idea of power differentials has to do with the different dynamics and hierarchies, I guess there are in any kind of connection or relationship. So specifically in an educational context, usually the person with the most knowledge is the teacher. And so there's a sort of power differential. There's an, I guess, difference in where they sit in a hierarchy. So it can be intimidating if someone has a higher position power wise than you. So for students acquiring a second language, maybe they don't feel competent or they're intimidated by someone that dominates that language a lot better than they do. So when you reduce that, when you age match students, when you say instead of it being a tutor to T relationship, they're both tutoring one another, they're both competent in their native languages, and they're both learning the language of the other person, I think that reduces that gap.
And well, again, these questions are for all of you. Um, what field of applied linguistics would you relate power differentials to? And this is for all three of you.
Well, I think that I could be relate this to the social linguistics, since they are a peer working. They are like also related to the scaffolding that we have learned about Vygotsky, and how this, as Alana mentioned, these power differentials is that the native speakers can help the non-native to go learning in a better way the language, because they have the chance to share time with the natives, and they can, for example, learn the accent. But this peer, like, mentoring or tutoring that they are having, it's going to be beneficial for both of them, the native and the non-native speaker, since one is going to be able to know the needs of the other one and can feel like helpful to the learning of the non-native, and the other one is going to is going to try to be at the same level of the native speaker.
Mhm. Okay, thank you, Paco. And on that note,
Thank you.
how would you, and again for the three of you, how would you compare or contrast this article that Alana speaks about to Oral Portfolio in Spanish as a third language? And this is the one by Pierre-Luc Paquet and Sarah Down. So are there any aspects that you
Oh,
can compare? Or, sorry, Paco, go ahead.
it's okay. Thank you very much. Yes, I can compare this to the oral portfolio, because the methodology that was used in the oral portfolio article is like students had to self-assess their own oral productions, but also they were supported by other peers assessment. So they were working hand by hand, and they were like assessing the other ones, like pointing out the aspects they could improve in both of them. Mhm.
And if you
It's
had to,
also from social linguistics. Hmm.
okay, yes, that's what I was going to ask you. You had to relate this to
Yeah,
a field or several fields, maybe, of applied linguistics. Which ones would you?
yeah, definitely social linguistics, because of the peer work they are doing.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Okay, so social linguistics. And what about psycholinguistics? Do you think there could be elements of psycholinguistics in this article?
I think so,
Yes, I
definitely.
think so. Because, uh
Go ahead, Paco.
yeah, this article also mentions that to self-assess, the students also had to develop the skill of meta-linguistic reflection. So it has to do with the processes they have in mind and how they perceive themselves about their learning of the language.
Hmm. And Alana, you
Mhm.
wanted to.
That was exactly what I was going to add about metalinguistic awareness and how that tool is
Mhm.
developed. I think when you're doing self assessment, sometimes it's harder to be critical of your own work. It's like the idea of a fish and not being aware of the water that's around it. But when you look at someone else's work with a new perspective, I think that really facilitates that metalinguistic awareness that the students can then apply to their own work later on.
Okay, Alana. And Paco, this was the article you selected, right? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, so could you give us just a description maybe of the purpose, research questions, methodology of this article?
Yeah, well, there's no research question. There's just a problem that the author stated about how to assess the oral competencies of the students that are taking classes in an online environment. We know that sometimes the technology is not that enough to evaluate the oral production of the students, the oral skills, and so they decided and they designed this instrument, the oral portfolio. So this could do things easier for students to be assessed. Students had to record 4 entries about several topics they had to read, and whenever the entries were uploaded in the Facebook platform, uh, they went back to their entries and self-assess, and then the other peers have to go also to watch these videos and give their opinions. Mhm. And
Okay.
the goal was this. The first one is to evaluate their other competencies, but also creating the meta linguistics reflection of the
Okay.
students.
So if you, Paco, or if any one of you had to assess this, what Paco just mentioned, oral competency in an online environment, how would you go about this in the field of applied linguistics?
Okay, I can go first. I was thinking also about that option that sometimes there is no time to do the evaluation in synchronous class, and I could ask the students to get in pairs, and then they record a conversation and send me the link to watch it.
Okay, good.
Mhm.
And this would be, would you do it from a social linguistic approach, a psycholinguistic, morphological, phonological? What approach do you see yourself carrying this research out in?
I would do it more like phonology to watch their students pronunciation, for example, and also social linguistics, because both of the students will contribute to their evaluation.
Okay. Okay, Paco.
And well, it has to do also with SLA. Mhm.
Okay, and how so with SLA?
Well, because this is a way that I'm going to evaluate if they are improving their learning,
Mhm.
because if they have been my students, and I need to measure their improvements during the course.
Okay, so in SLA, you would be measuring maybe or following this process of language acquisition to recap
Yes.
the commentary.
Mhm.
Okay, very good. So, jumping off of this article, I would now like to discuss. There's another article that discusses this online learning, and it is whose article is it? It is challenges and impact of teaching English in limited access to technology environment. So for this article, just to recap, this article was the one that talked about the use of fun activities and games in technology in this kind of teaching environment. I don't know if you guys remember this one. And I would like to know, what do you think this article is an example of? What field of applied linguistics do you consider this article as an example of?
Well, I think that it's an example of second language acquisition.
Hmm.
Uh, since there are some strategies to deliver the content in an online environment, uh, sometimes we know that the technology is not, you cannot do the same activities in the classroom, but than using technology. And students need, or better said, teachers, we need to keep our students engaged to the class. And this is why we look for example, games that challenge us to know how to improve our teaching in an online environment and keep our students in the class all the time, because they get bored or they get tired. And by using this, we can like succeed in the online class.
Okay.
I think it also relates to sociolinguistics, just talking about the context. So if these are under-resourced communities that haven't had maybe so much experience with certain kinds of technology, I think it could be really new and exciting and like Bucko mentioned, like engaging for them because I've seen in other contexts, maybe for example at a school in Spain with students who use Kahoot all the time, they don't really care about it. It's not really engaging. But this
Hmm.
article had a lot of examples of how students were really jumping into the learning because of this. So I think that relates directly to their sociolinguistics. linguistic context as well.
Okay, so far we have second language acquisition, Paco mentioned, like this process, and then Alana social linguistics. I think it's very interesting that you mentioned the underprivileged aspect because this is something that is stressed throughout the whole article, that these are underprivileged third graders. And so, on that note, what do you think about this in relation to this reading that we did in the semester to language and education with this aspect? Do you think there is a relation to this, or do you not?
Well, yes, I think there's a connection between the two things. I guess I consider with language and education the idea of barriers and institutions and all of the things that happen even outside of the classroom that affect the way that the education is implemented, that affect certain biases. I think it's also important. I don't know. It's when research is being done with certain communities that are not privileged like other ones, I think it risks being kind of it can be condescending. And so the idea of like, oh, language and education, like we are bringing this technology to these poor kids. I think maybe certain biases that are related to that are pretty prevalent.
Yes, I agree with your statement, and this goes back to what you stated at the beginning of the power differentials.
Hmm.
This has a lot to do with that. As you say, it is usually this discourse of we're bringing education and technology to these underprivileged communities, and it seems like we are saving them from
Yeah.
their lower than education. Okay, Elena, thank you. And would any of you like to add to this, Rafa or Paco? No? Okay. Okay, so I think that from here, this is a good point to talk about this other article that is very similar, which is rethinking English language teaching through Telegram, WhatsApp, Google Classroom, and Zoom. And this is a very recent article which talks about these social media apps, like the ones I mentioned, right now in this context of COVID. And it was about, if you remember, it was about these different studies with AESL teachers and these apps that they employed. And so for this one, again, I would like for us to discuss why we think this article is significant to the area of applied linguistics or to the context in general.
Can I start?
Okay, yeah, yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, this, as you mentioned, well, starting with the title, rethinking through Telegram, WhatsApp, Google Classroom, and Zoom. And as you mentioned, we are living within a pandemic, so we cannot have these traditional classes in the classroom. So as teachers, we have had to take the technology we have at hand in trying to deliver the classes. And for example, these are the most used platforms nowadays. For example, everybody has a WhatsApp or Telegram, and they are being useful to share files or pictures of materials to create these forum groups. This also Zoom to have these video conferences as a class, as time of class in a synchronous way, and also the classroom, the Google Classroom, to like post task for our students so they can have something to do in an asynchronous way. In this way, we try to adapt our classes to this environment. Mhm.
Okay, so we can say that this article is relevant because of the current situation we are living through right now, and also because
Yes.
these are strategies that we have adopted as teachers, correct?
Yes, exactly. I agree.
Okay. And Alana, would you like to add to that?
I would like to add something. It's in a little bit of a different direction, but it's about the methodology of this. So I think, like Paco mentioned, the context, right? We're living in a really historical, like global pandemic. So they really got this article together. They did their case study. It was pretty quick. But I think I would have wanted a little bit more because from the different examples, there were kind of the same overall themes of teachers saying, yes, this worked, it was great. But I think maybe the data could have been richer if the case study had also involved some kind of pre pandemic reflection on technology versus post. I think that contrast would be a lot more interesting. It would be a way to really, I think, get at the heart of this change because of the pandemic as well.
Okay, so if let's say you conducted this study, how would you approach it? You mentioned that you would like the data to be richer pre-pandemic. So
Mhm.
how do you think you could approach this study yourself?
I think I would use semi structured interviews and definitely get a gauge of before and after the pandemic because I think there, and this might just be me having certain expectations of what I would think would be there, but it seemed overall very, very positive. Like, oh, everything's great. The kids love it. But I think it's a really complex issue. I think there are more nuanced perspectives there. I think I would also include some direct text from the teachers if possible. I don't know, I don't think this was done originally in English, but even a translation or something like that, I think would make everything a bit more specific. I think it's a little vague right now. So if I were to do it, I would want to show more specific examples of the ideas.
Okay, Elena, thank you. And Rafa, would you like to comment on why this article is significant?
Well, as Paco mentioned, also Alana, I think it's relevant to this time. I wouldn't say that it will be like historically accurate. I don't know if it would survive because it's very like present forward. But um, I mean, we are like, even though we are like living on the pandemic, we're still living on a very like technological world. Like technology is like raising, growing, advancing. So the implementation of Telegram, WhatsApp, Google Classroom, Zoom, and other platforms or apps can benefit the EFL classrooms.
Hmm. Okay. So just to recap your comment, this is relevant because, as Paco mentioned, the moment we are living in, but you are not sure that this would stand the test of time. Maybe if we look at it 10 years from now, it wouldn't really stand.
I would say no if we based it on the fact of this is happening because of a pandemic. If we base it on the fact that it's technology, I would say yeah.
Okay.
Otherwise, no.
Okay. Thank you, Rafa. And then I see in some of the comments that we made to this article that it was linked to SLA and social linguistics. And for this article, to close it, I would just like to know how is this article an example of social linguistics?
I think at the risk of being repetitive, I am going to mention power differentials again.
Okay.
So I think with students having access to their teachers in, I think, a more instant way, that power differential is that gap is closing. And then also for them to be able to interact with each other on this one platform, I think it's kind of leveling. And so maybe social dynamic wise, kids that might be digital natives are very competent with technology may feel more comfortable, maybe learning and just engaging in language activities through this format.
Mhm. Okay, Alana, thank you. And
I,
Rafa or Paco, yes?
okay, I would like to add something. This is also a collaborative work among peers. They are like tutoring. They as the article said, they were like writing and texting each other so they could receive feedback from their peers. So it's also this collaborative work in among the students.
Okay, so it's related to social linguistics because of this aspect of the power differentials, but also because the work itself that the students were doing was collaborative, right?
Yes.
Also, I think speech communities, we have a two speech communities, one being from Catalonia and the second being from Scotland.
Mhm.
Okay. And the last question for this is that in this article, it is mentioned, as you guys say, that they are working with these kinds of apps and everything seems to be working very well considering the situation. But what I noticed was that a lot of teachers mentioned, well, these students are uh, like they're low resource students and they don't have access to the internet. And this always seemed to be the main problem in most of the contexts. So again, this problem of underprivileged students with no contact to internet, in what field of applied linguistics could we discuss an aspect like this one?
Well, I would link that to language and education.
How so, Rafa?
Well, as you mentioned, we're talking about an unprivileged community where they don't have access to internet, so that will make them or classify them as underprivileged.
Okay, so if you had to approach this problem, and maybe you have already had this problem because we are also teaching online during a pandemic, how would you approach this? Students who have no internet because they are low resources.
Yeah, so I would think that it's like sort of complicated, like as well, we as teachers to be able to have students connect to internet like all the time or like synchronously. So I would say that if we want to like achieve such goal of students using technologies, it would like we would have to be like flexible enough to work with students like asynchronously.
Mhm. Yes, I think you make a very good point because most schools are resistant to work asynchronously, and if especially public schools, and if students, it was also mentioned in this article that if they don't show up for synchronous classes, they just interpret it as, oh, they don't have the interest
Yeah.
in showing up. But these are just factors such as the ones we are talking about right now of why students cannot yeah, it's impossible for them to show up to these online classes, right? Yes, Paco.
Can I thank you very much? Yes, I could add like, for example, the Google Classroom can have some asynchronous tasks for the students. And for example, in my case, I use it and I teach on Monday and Wednesday, and I give them homework, but the deadline is until next Sunday, so they have a lot of time to get maybe to a cyber and get a computer and just do the homework, and that's it. They don't need a connection permanently, and we as teachers we need to be more tolerant with them so we can receive the homework they have. And in the case of WhatsApp, most of the phone companies they already offer this app within the prepaid or
Mm-hmm.
postpaid services of the company.
Mm-hmm.
So this can be helpful for them and for those students who have no access permanent access to the internet.
Okay, Paco, yes. Actually, I thought that was also interesting because in the article it doesn't mention Google Classroom. It just mentions a lot of these texting apps like WhatsApp. But other apps that could work asynchronously like Google Classroom aren't really approached. And I think it would be insightful if they were. It would add another depth. And okay, so we have done most of the online classes, the online articles, I'm sorry. And I would like to go now. We have several articles that are related to these concepts of identity. And I think we can start with this one that was like a chapter in a book that is cross-cultural comparisons. So for this, I was curious to know your reactions to why this article would be significant to the area of applied linguistics.
I think that language inherently implies culture, and so languages don't exist in vacuums. They're related to different cultures. So, with applied linguistics, when we're thinking about the acquisition of other languages or just certain dynamics that cultures related to languages have, I think this kind of guide may be helpful for knowing how to best approach certain I guess research strategies within the cross cultural context.
Okay, so it would be, just to recap your comment, it would be like an approach, an interesting way to culturally approach these areas.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you. And Rafa and Paco, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I think that this could be approached by social linguistics since the context where the children were growing up are being compared with the ones to the others in order to look for strategies to try to give a better teaching to these kids according to their context.
Okay, yes. Also, as you say, the context of social linguistics, because if we are culturally comparing it, I think it naturally emerges from this, and also maybe concepts such as global English, depending what we are comparing culturally and where we're comparing it.
Also, language variation, since we don't like it, the chapter doesn't specify which cultures we are aimed on the topic. So, like a language variation would be also like an area that will be intended because of like the languages that are being taught from and at.
Yes, like the inherent variation when we're discussing cultures and even a same language. And from this, when we're talking about language, I think we can begin to talk about aspects of identity. And I want to go to this article, which is related to transnationals. And it's called I Was Lucky to Be a Bilingual Kid, and That Makes Me Who I Am. And it's the role of transnationalism in identity issues. And for this article, I first would like to know your impressions on this article. Like, what makes this relevant or significant to our field of applied linguistics?
Well, I would like to say that well, this is an article that is looking for the stories of bilingual teachers who were migrating between Mexico and the U.S. and how they constructed their identity because of these changes on the countries they have been traveling through back and forth. And of course, that this is like a different perspective because I don't have this perspective because I'm a non-native speaker and I have been never been abroad in the U.S. But they have another perspective and this is helpful for them to construct or to see, to explain how they perceive themselves.
Okay. And Alana or Rafa?
I think overall, I found it to be a really fascinating article. I really liked the structure of it because I think the issue of identity is something that is so personal and so unique to each individual. I think you see all of these different cases and you could make generalizations about, okay, maybe some experience in the US and some experience in Mexico, but how it affects them and even the social implications of everything was pretty interesting. Like I found, I'm trying to remember exactly. I think in one part there was a mention of a student trying to actually diminish their English to not intimidate their teacher in
Yes.
Mexico, and I thought that was pretty heartbreaking. Like you have this ability to speak a language and you're trying to make yourself smaller and not take up as much space. And I think when it comes when it has to do with identity, how you relate to others is something that's important in shaping that. And so definitely sociolinguistics and any of the implications or connotations that others may assign to you based on what languages you speak or what languages you don't speak and they think you should. So, yeah.
Yes, I think.
Also,
Yes.
sorry.
Sorry, Rafa, go ahead.
So also from what Alana just said, we can narrow it down to narratives because of like how they told their stories. So it's sort of like an autobiography of their lives. So yeah, I would say that an area that it can like an area of applied linguistics that it can be narrowed down, it will be narratives.
Yes, I think narratives, for sure, is a very interesting way of looking at, well, all of these aspects of bilingual transnational teachers. And as Alana was mentioning before, this is very related to the use of language and how this shapes your identity. Because there was also, I think the last teacher they talked to was someone who was very, very insistent on not accepting that they had come to Mexico. I think they had been deported, and they were still thinking, I don't want to know Spanish. I want to continue using English. They looked for activities that would allow them to use English, like enrolling in an American football team and things like this, like to not lose the contact. And then at the end, it mentioned that, well, even though this person just got married and they're living in Mexico, they are still insisting that one day they're going to go back to the US. And these aspects are so interesting because, well, yes, language, I think that for these people that were mentioned, language was a very important area of how they perceived themselves and how they thought others perceived them as well. And do you have anything to add about this article? I don't know the approach of the article. Do you agree with it? Why or why not? And this approach is the narrative approach, as Rafa mentioned.
Yes, I agree because I think this is the best way to know about their stories with the narratives and the autobiographies they were using to explain or to show us how they have become these bilingual teachers.
Hmm. Okay, so you agree with the approach because it follows a process, correct? Like it follows a story. And Rafa?
Well, in my case, I wouldn't like necessarily call it an autobiography because sometimes autobiographies are um, sort of like conducted by the participant and not they are not directed by the researcher. Like it will be part of a life story,
Uh-huh.
but I think it will be just a biography, not so much an autobiography.
Okay.
I don't know how to explain the difference between one and the other.
Okay. Yeah, I think I see your point. I think you feel that in one, the autobiography, the participant has more control over the, yes, over the story, maybe.
Yeah, over what is going to be told. And on a life story, the researcher is the one that is like conducting where the story is going.
Okay. Yes. Yes, I do understand what you meant. And Alana, do you agree with this approach? Or why not?
I think it's a pretty solid approach overall, but I noticed within the article there's a table of participant profiles, and so some of the common themes are codified and they're given a frequency count, right? So like based on certain emergent themes, and for example, language skills, are they bilingual, monolingual in English, proficient in English, and in the process of learning Spanish? And I think that could lead to an interesting quantitative analysis. Maybe I'm not sure how that would be set up in terms of number of participants, but I do think that these emergent themes could be explored in a mixed methods format as well.
Yes, I think that maybe in a mixed method, it would be, um, for my perception, it would maybe be difficult because
Mm,
this requires, well, yes, like we were mentioning, this narrative approach, and I'm not sure how easy or how difficult that would be with a higher number of participants, like eliciting this kind of information or data from all of them.
yeah, I think it would be tough, but I remember someone mentioning that there are computer programs that can kind of identify, like, if there's a theme of like bilingualism, like that word, and select it, but it's not always the most accurate. So
Uh-huh.
I think for accuracy, it would be better to have people go through the narratives, but that would be just a huge, large scale study and very time consuming.
Yes, time consuming. Okay, so we have recapped this article, and from here we can go to another article that talks about identity, which is drawing identity, beginning pre-service teachers' professional identities. And I know that everyone has comments about this one because it is such a very interesting approach to the purpose, to the questions, having the teachers actually draw their identity. This is literally drawing their identity. And first of all, what do you think about the approach to this study?
So I think it was a very interesting approach in my case because I had never seen it or heard of it. Also, what I found interesting about this approach is that it only focused on the drawings, even though some of the drawings had some like written parts on it. The researchers found or decided that they were not going to focus on any written descriptions of the drawings. So it was very interesting to read about it.
Mm-hmm. And Alana or Paco?
Yes, I agree with Rafa. I also found it quite interesting how they constructed the perceptions of self just because of the drawings, and how the different elements they were taking to these drawings uh, played an important role. For example, the artifacts, the students, or the absence of this in the drawing, and how they interpreted this as a kind of relationship with or no with their students, and how this get this relevance for define the teacher's identity.
I think it's definitely a creative approach, and I don't know how I feel about not including the text in the analysis because I think it's with the original intent of the teachers that are doing the drawings. I think the text adds to the picture itself. So, in terms of analysis, the researchers are relying really heavily on their own perceptions and what they kind of can ascertain based off of these drawings. But I think they did a good job of categorizing different patterns that they saw. But at the same time, I do think it is pretty relative and can be a bit subjective. It kind of reminds me of like almost a psychological analysis, so it would be related to psycholinguistics, right? Like the blot tests or I think the Rorschach tests where you have like this image and you interpret it. And so maybe saying, okay, what did they draw and what does this mean about them psychologically? But it's reaching, it's creative, but maybe a bit reaching.
So, do you guys think that there would be another method that could be used to approach this same purpose of eliciting identity?
I would say it needs a complementary
Yeah.
approach or a technique. Not so. I'm not saying that drawing is not like a good approach. I'm just saying that drawing by itself doesn't sound like really reliable as for what Alana just mentioned. Maybe interviews, maybe interviews.
Okay.
Well, I could also say that narratives could be another approach. So maybe the drawings they are like drawing, they could explain like put them into words in a narrative or story. Like they explaining they have their drawing and then this element means this and this element means that and this is significant for me because of this in a kind
Mm,
of short or long story.
Okay.
I really like that idea, and I like what Rafa said too. I think the data really needs to be triangulated, and having some other ways to complement it would be more successful. So, like with what Paco said, kind of giving the participants more agency and how their message is being interpreted by saying, okay, this is what this means to me. Because I don't know, like someone drew a tree, and a tree can mean a lot of different things to different people on a metaphorical level. So I think that would definitely help with some interviews, with some other data to help get the whole picture.
Yes, I think that with this, it is very, I think, semantic based, but semantic not on looking at semantics from the view of the user speaker, but just my semantic or pragmatic interpretation of what is happening in this drawing. So maybe it is not semantic or pragmatic approach in itself, but
Mhm.
just interpretation from the point of view of the researcher. And I saw in the notes for this, it was added that this was related to narratives. And this research, as it is, would you consider it a narrative approach? Why or why not?
Well, I think it's a narrative because narratives are not only written, but also could be like a story in a different way, told in a different way. For example, could be a song, or could be like a podcast, for example. And in this case, they are using the visual aids to deliver their story. It's like a comic, for example, with just the images, and they follow a sequence and maybe which we'll need to elicit some questions to the drawer and say, can you elaborate a little bit more about this element of your drawing? And so voila, we can have the explanation.
Okay.
I also agree with Paco that it is a narrative. It tells a story. What what I also think is that they came short because the drawings were interpreted by the researchers, not so much by the participants. So are we getting the narrative of the participant, or are we getting the narrative from what the researcher thought was that narrative?
Okay. And Alana, do you want to add to that?
I think I agree with looking at narratives from a bunch of different contexts. I think like a song, like a comic. Um, but yeah, and just to reiterate what Rafa said, it seems more like the researcher's narrative than specifically the participants' narratives, but I think they did this drawing in a workshop. So I think they had a portfolio or they had other elements that maybe could have been things to contribute to that narrative, maybe essays or other kinds of reflections.
Okay, so as we can see, and as we read in this semester, a narrative can be elicited even from a drawing such as this one. But also we have to be very careful with narratives because as you mentioned, what narrative are we getting? Are we getting the participants' narrative, the researchers' narrative, or maybe if we just looked at them like this, we could apply our own narrative to these drawings. So yes, I think this is an aspect of applied linguistics that we need to be very careful with, which is narratives. And on these topics of identity and speech communities, I think we can approach. There are two articles that are pretty similar that discuss music and the identities, and there is one about hip hop and slang, and there is another one about heavy metal. And I want to know, this is a general question, how would you compare these articles in themes or approaches? Or also, how would you contrast these articles?
Well, as I mentioned before with the drawings, narratives, I think that this can be related also to narratives because they are songs. And for example, in the case of slang, this has a lot of context implied because of the social where it emerges, and we know that language changes from region to region, and sometimes hip hop is telling stories about some with some messages that they need or they want to be heard uh, because of society. And so here I'm like combining social linguistics and also the narratives they are using to convey the message through the song. Hmm.
Okay, so very interesting. I think also what you're getting at is hip hop as a kind of speech community in the context
Yes,
of social linguistics, and maybe slang or hip hop music like a socialect. I think
exactly.
we can
Yes.
also get something like that. And would Alana or Rafa like to add to this?
Sure. I don't know. I would definitely, before reading these articles, I would think of hip hop and speech communities as something really related, but I'd never considered metal to, or that genre to pertain to a certain kind of speech community or group, even though it very clearly does in this article. I think they mentioned a lot of different themes that they pulled out of these lyrics and then the social context relating to why. So, what kinds of oppression or what kind of moment in history made certain people feel that they needed to express this kind of angst, I guess, through music. But in terms of approaches, I guess to contrast the two, I think the attitudinal meaning and social struggle in heavy metal song lyrics, a corpus based analysis was a lot more systematic and structured. Um, just in terms of, I think, the lexical frequency counts and then the analysis of it. I think in the hip hop article, the methods were kind of glossed over, and suddenly there was an explanation like, okay, here's what this word means, and here's an example of it in context. And did you know that youth in the US listen to 2.5 hours more of music a day? Like, I think it was a little unfocused in terms of the information that was presented.
Okay. So we can say that while it did share similar themes, such as the social linguistic approaches, maybe in the heavy metal one, some discourse analysis also. But I do agree with your observation that the heavy metal one was more systematic, and I think it drew more from a theoretical approach to justify the study as compared to the hip hop article. And Rafa, would you like to add to this?
Yes, I was basically going to say that on the heavy metal, I think the approach was more on the perceptions. And I think on the hip hop one, the approach was more on the use of the language. Like on the heavy metal was what does that language or words or jargon was
Okay. And I just also want to highlight in these articles this music from a point of view of identity. From the heavy metal one, we could really see that people considered this music to be part of their way of life, of their identity. It was something that defined them. And I found it interesting that, and I really hadn't considered that it doesn't mean the same thing to someone in the US as it does to somebody that lives in a different context, different economical, religious, or social context in, let's say, somewhere like Pakistan, for example. And this was a very insightful article, heavy metal. The hip hop one was also, it also had the potential to be interesting and insightful, but I'm not sure if the approach was appropriate for this hip hop article. And do you have anything to add to to these two articles? Just like general observations, maybe?
I don't know. It's kind of like crazy for me to see in the hip hop article all of these slang words like written out, and here's the definition, right? Because you think of maybe the Oxford English Dictionary and what words are in there versus slang. And so to see slang written down and defined and examples of it was kind of funny for me to read. Like I'm not used to seeing it in this context.
Yes, I think that when we see it in an academic context, you actually see what you're saying. And because I think some of us do use this slang, and seeing it written down was like, oh, I say this. How embarrassing. Okay, and I think we can wrap up this discussion group with Rafa, your article that you selected. Can you please describe it to us?
Yes, so in the case of this article, well, its name is Systematical Methodological Review Developing a Framework for a Qualitative Semi-Structured Interview Guide. In this article, what the authors tried to produce was a framework to develop a qualitative semi-structured interview guide. Yeah, so that's like pretty clear since the title. Um, so basically, what the authors did was they collected thousands of papers, but they also narrow it down to only 10 articles. 10 articles that use the semi-structured interview as a technique. And from those 10 articles, they analyzed them. And from that analysis, they created a 5 phases framework to develop a qualitative semi-structured interview type.
And as applied linguist, this question is for everybody. Why do you think this article is relevant as applied linguist?
I think it's difficult to create a good, like a successful interview. So to have some kind of structure or guide is really helpful. Like when we're doing research, I think what we've seen a lot in Brian's class is that maybe it's deceptively simple to collect data through qualitative methods. It's like, oh, just an interview or just a questionnaire, but really in order to get the kind of data that is valuable and relevant to what you're studying, it really has to be well thought out. And so I think this maybe could help avoid a lot of pain for doing or having a poorly structured kind of interview.
Yes, also, so this is sort of like what Alana is saying, that maybe we think it's easy. The literature doesn't have like a lot of research on this area of like developing an interview guide of any kind. and maybe that's why we think like it's easy, because we don't have the literature.
Mhm.
It, like, not that it doesn't exist, but people don't publish it. They do them, but they just don't publish them. So that's what these authors like try to do. Like, it exists, like interview guides exist, just like people don't write about them. So here's a guide. So also I would like to point out that this is not a guide on how to make interview guides. It only gives you the phases that were identified in the 10 articles.
Yes, and I think that this article is very important because it can be taken from any area of applied linguistics. You could do an interview for, I don't know, social linguistics, for pragmatics, for semantics, for any area. And as you say, for interviews, we tend to think, or for qualitative analysis, like, oh, this is very easy, I'll just do this. And especially semi-structured interviews where you say, I have some questions, and then, pues ahí vemos. But, but yes, this article is very insightful because it makes you see that, well, it's not really as you think. It's not really as simple. All of these considerations. And Paco, do you have something to add to this?
Yes, I agree with you, Debbie, that any person within the field in a certain moment of their lives, of our lives, we are going to do research. And this is one of the main techniques to collect data in a qualitative approach. So this is very important. And as Rafa said, this article doesn't mention how to do the great semi-structured interview, but it guides us a little bit to be aware of what things we need to take into consideration to think that we are designing a good semi-structured interview. Because we know that if we do not have the correct technique or the correct questions, so we're going to get grabbed for the information, and maybe this is going to be useless, and it's going to be just a waste of time if we don't have the best interview we need. So yes, I agree with you and with Rafa and also with Alana. This is a great article. As Rafa said, there's no too much or enough research about this topic of designing semi-structured interviews, but definitely is one of the most useful articles we could have read.
Okay. Well, I think we have covered the articles and just a few closing statements. We have seen that in all these articles, they share themes, even though they seem very different, and they could be considered different approaches to these areas of applied linguistics that we have seen throughout the semester. We saw a lot of social linguistic implications in articles where we, at first glance, didn't think that it was really there. Discursal analysis also. And we discussed a lot second language acquisition. Most of them had to do with this aspect. I'm sorry, and also um, psycholinguistics. There were a lot of approaches that, as I mentioned again, at first glance it seems like they aren't there, but when we really get to analyzing it, and especially from this experience we have now, that throughout the semester we have read, we can see how all of this is actually applied like in practice. And just to finish up, I want to thank you for being here today. I know it's kind of early. And do you have any more comments to add? No? Okay, well, if there are no more comments, then I think that's